Though video game publishers put an awful amount of stock into the Metacritic scores of their releases, there's really no accounting for taste. We all like what we like, and if you can't agree with your best friend over which games you like and they like, then what chance do you have of agreeing with critics you've never met who have completely different tastes to you? So let's have a chat about them. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 recent video games that critics hated but players loved. Number 10. Days Gone. Days Gone was one of Sony's most anticipated AAA exclusives during the PlayStation 4 generation, though ended up releasing 2 wildly lukewarm reviews, netting a paltry 71 Metascore. When compared to other PS4 exclusive blockbusters like Bloodborne, Uncharted 4, Horizon Zero Dawn, God of War, Marvel's Spider-Man, Ghost of Tsushima, and The Last of Us Part 2, it was the weakest of the bunch by far. Critics complained that Days Gone failed to be more than a fairly cookie-cutter open-world action game, offering up a generic, unremarkable sandbox matched by a mediocre story and uninteresting lead character. Many also felt that the game's critical path massively outstayed its welcome, yet it fared better with general players, with almost 10,000 Metacritic user votes awarding it an 8.4 average score. Additionally, when the game hit PC, it received an 8.7 score, as well as a highly positive rating on Steam from over 20,000 players. While players are generally far more forgiving of over-familiar mechanics and aesthetics than critics, that surely can't entirely account for the critic/player disparity here. Despite selling relatively well across PS4 and later PC, Sony decided not to press forward with a sequel, reportedly due to the disappointing critical reception. Number 9. The Ascent. Cyberpunk-themed action RPG The Ascent sure looked like an absolute blast pre-release, but reviews were ultimately disappointingly middling, with Metascores of 68 on Xbox Series X and a somewhat sunnier 74 on PC. For a game which Microsoft marketed fairly heavily and pushed extensively in their various live streams, it was undeniably a letdown, with many critics lambasting The Ascent's mediocre shooting mechanics, nothing story, repetitive mission design, and especially its abundance of bugs. Players were far more enthusiastic, however, with the game landing a 7.9 and 7.8 score on Xbox Series X and PC respectively. Its Steam rating is also mostly positive from over 11,000 customers. This gulf of opinion can somewhat be explained though. The version of The Ascent that was played pre-release by critics was riddled with bugs which had been patched out by the time that much of the general public got around to playing it. A large chunk of regular players therefore got a considerably more hassle-free experience, which likely aided them in being less bothered by its repetitious aspects. That and the fact that many played it for free on Xbox Game Pass, which is certainly going to make otherwise objectionable elements a little easier to accept. Number 8. SpongeBob SquarePants Battle for Bikini Bottom Rehydrated. SpongeBob SquarePants Battle for Bikini Bottom received mixed to positive reviews when it was originally released for the PlayStation 2, Xbox, and GameCube all the way back in 2003. But when the Rehydrated remake came out in 2020, critics weren't quite so thrilled. The new version landed an unremarkable 68 Metascore on PS4, with many reviewers noting that little effort had been made to update the original platformer for modern audiences. As a result, much of the gameplay felt unpolished and unreasonably frustrating to contemporary players, who may reasonably have been expecting some quality of life refinements. Incredibly though, the user score from over 2,000 players sits at a stonking 8.9, and on Steam it holds an overwhelmingly positive rating from over 9,000 users. It's not much of a secret that jaded critics are considerably less susceptible to nostalgia than players, especially players who would ever consider buying a remake of an almost 20-year-old SpongeBob SquarePants game, which likely accounts for the divide. Players with their warm, fuzzy memories of the original and more forgiving attitude towards its more dated mechanics simply relished the dopamine boost this nostalgia treat gave them, complete with some shiny new graphics to match. The definition of comfort food. Number 7. Travis Strikes Again, No More Heroes. The No More Heroes games have generally been well received by critics, though 2019's Travis Strikes Again remains the outlier of the 4 mainline titles. With a mere 67 Metascore, most critics were lukewarm at best on the game, with many dismissing it as a bland, repetitive hack-and-slash title that felt more like a limp imitation of a Suda51 game, and one that at 8 hours in length grossly overstayed its welcome. Players gave it a far more welcoming 7.8 user score though, and on Steam it retains a very positive review rating. Given that Travis Strikes Back is an unashamedly for the fans game, that might account for it performing better with its customer niche. There's also the fact that players were much less likely than critics to be blasting through the game, because when you have to review a game you usually have to meet an embargo, and likely became exhausted by the repetition on offer. And the fact that it launched for the cheaper budget price of $29.99 probably didn't hurt either. Number 6. Pathologic II. Open-world survival horror game Pathologic II received wildly polarizing reviews upon its release, scoring 9 out of 10 from Edge magazine, but to the same token landing 5 out of 10 from GameSpot, while Rock Paper Shotgun hated it enough that they didn't even finish it. Its Metacritic score shook out an aggressively mediocre 64 on Xbox One and a slightly better 70 on PC. Though some critics praised its atmosphere and ambition, it was widely raked over the coals for its frustratingly demanding survival mechanics, abundance of bugs, and rather irritating combat. Conversely, the user rating settled on an impressive 8.7, and on Steam it holds a very positive rating from over 5,000 players. Beyond the fact that anyone throwing down cash for this sort of game is likely well acquainted with its brutal difficulty, post-release Ice Pick Lodge reluctantly released 16 difficulty sliders to aid struggling players, which reviewers obviously didn't have access to while playing. You can bet that if this game launched with the sliders in the first place, reviews would have been considerably kinder. Number 5. Medieval. 2019's remake of classic 1998 action-adventure game Medieval was highly anticipated by players before release, though reviews were intensely mixed, leading to an underwhelming 67 Metascore. The sticking point for many, as with the aforementioned Battle for Bikini Bottom remaster, is that the new Medieval is basically faithful to a fault. The controls are still not great, the camera is, well, horrible in places, and yet its biggest sin must surely be refusing to add checkpoints to levels. And so, despite its graphical glow-up, critics struggle to recommend Medieval, especially to new players who would find its dated systems rather frustrating and cumbersome. As a result, it makes sense that the game performed well within nostalgic niche circles, racking up a user score of 8.1, with many players praising its fastidious faithfulness to the original and even insisting that fellow players shouldn't listen to the critics. Number 4. Left Alive. Okay, so Left Alive is one of the worst reviewed games released by a major studio in the last few years. I played it myself, and I absolutely hated it. And the fact that there are people out there that really enjoyed this game makes me just ask one question. Why? Actually, a follow-up question. How? How could you enjoy this game? But still, people did. Because even though on PS4, where it got a pathetic 37 rating on Metacritic, and was panned by just about every major gaming publication for its stiff controls, brutally unforgiving stealth mechanics, inconsistent AI, bland graphics, and excess of glitches, when it came to the player base, however, Left Alive rocks a strong 8.2 on PS4 and an even higher 8.5 on PC. Now here's the thing, while some have accused Square Enix of inflating the user scores with bots, a less nefarious explanation is that shortly after the release of this game, Square Enix released a patch which introduced a new casual difficulty level. If nothing else, this made the game basically playable without massive frustration, even if it did fail to remedy Left Alive's many other failings. Still, a cursory look at the game's subreddit confirms that it does indeed have a loyal and rather passionate cabal of fans. Tough though that might be to believe. Number 3. Balan Wonderworld. Square Enix strikes again here, but this time with last year's platformer Balan Wonderworld. Critics similarly got their fangs out for this game, with the PC version scoring a depressing 38 on Metacritic, while the PS5 version, the platform that most critics played it on, topped out at a slightly better 51. Like Left Alive, it was pilloried by most mainstream outlets for basically being a generic, tedious platformer that was low on creativity and high on repetition. Oh, and it's like 10 hours long, so it doesn't even have brevity on its side. Despite this, the user score on Xbox Series X is an impressive 7.2 and an even better 8.1 on Xbox One, with many players citing its colourful visuals and nostalgic throwback appeal to classic platformers. Again, players may have benefited from not having to race through such a needlessly long experience to meet a review embargo deadline, and are just generally forgiving, and let's face it, a lot of them are also Sonic the Hedgehog fans, and they'll put up with a lot. I mean, seriously, if you're a Sonic the Hedgehog fan, you know what you do. But played in more bite-sized chunks, it's easy to see how players might view it a lot more favourably, and seemingly love it enough to overlook or even embrace the very things that drove critics mad. Number 2. Terminator Resistance. Terminator Resistance was released shortly after the 6th movie Terminator Dark Fate, though strangely enough wasn't a tie-in game at all, but instead a totally standalone title just based on the IP. The PlayStation 4 version was released to a fair critical drubbing, landing a pitiful 47 Metascore, with reviewers tearing it apart for its muddy visuals, clunky combat, and all about generic gameplay. Most critics fobbed it off as a pretty typical video game based on a name IP, with more money spent on acquiring the license and investing in talented personnel to craft a quality game. The PC release release received a somewhat more charitable 60 Metascore, though the user score for both versions are markedly higher. The PS4 release has a 7.4 score and the PC version an 8.1, while also receiving a very positive rating from 8,000 plus reviews on Steam. Surprisingly good is a comment frequently discovered amongst the game's user reviews, perhaps implying that the brutal early reviews set them up for something far worse than what they got, which was formulaic, repetitive, and a bit janky, but fundamentally enjoyable for them. For many long-suffering Terminator fans, it was simply a relief to play a game based on the franchise that was basically functional and competent, which surely helped boost its player esteem. And number 1, Remothered Broken Porcelain. Though survival horror game Remothered Tormented Fathers received mostly positive reviews back in 2018, its 2020 sequel Remothered Broken Porcelain was conversely panned into the ground. While there was some errant praise for the atmosphere and aesthetics, it was blasted across all platforms for its poor AI, frequent crashes, and a fatal abundance of potentially game-breaking bugs. The PC version scored just 39 on Metacritic, with some critics going as far as to call it unplayable on launch due to the debilitating bugs, while others simply felt it was just too clunky and frustrating to recommend. However, the player score ranges from fair to great, with it scoring from 6.1 on PS4 to 8.0 on Switch. Unsurprisingly, many of the user reviews note that the developers released patches to fix many of the pre-release bugs that plagued critics, so the discrepancy is rather easily accounted for. Sadly, with most critics likely not revisiting the game post-launch, either for professional or personal purposes, their experience with the game is forever going to be tainted. And there we go, my friends. Those were 10 recent video games that critics hated but players loved. I hope that you enjoyed that, and please let me know what you thought about it down in the comments section below. Are you a Left Alive or Balan Wonderworld fan? Please sound off in the comments so I can know to avoid you. I'm joking. Of course I'm joking. Like what you like, my friends, at the end of the day. And if you want to chat to me further, you can do so over on Twitter at RetroJ with a 0, or you can swing by Live and Let's Dice, where I do all of my streaming outside of work, and it'd be great to see you over there, my friends. But before I go, I just want to say one thing. Today we were speaking a lot about people disagreeing on what they like, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. You can like whatever you like, as long as it doesn't infringe on the rights of anyone else or cause anyone else physical or mental harm. Then go out there and do what you love, because at the end of the day, if you are doing stuff that you enjoy, if it is making you feel like you are at your best, then that is truly the best way to live your life, healthily and happily. So go out there and absolutely smash it, you big ledge. As always, I've been Jules, you have been awesome. Never forget that, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye.